Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. John Gunnison and myself are back at it again. Sorry for the long layoff. We will be back doing shows more regularly coming up. But since our absence, there has been a ton of news. There's been war in Sudan. There was an election recently in Turkey, the first round. Now they're on a runoff. Tucker Carlson got fired from Fox News. Fox News lost a $780 million plus lawsuit to Dominion over pushing the big lie. And also, more recently, Ron DeSantis has been continuing his sink in the polls for the 2024 presidential election. But what John and I want to discuss today is a combination of meta-political media analysis along with digging into Trump's town hall, and maybe we'll even get into some succession. So, Mr. Gunnison, I think we should start off with Trump's town hall, which received a ton of media criticism. I think it was a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And primarily from the left, you had a lot of people criticizing CNN for embarking on this. And I think you and I may or may not have differences on this topic, but I'm one of the believers that think the progressives on Twitter and even more moderate folks need to just chill out. CNN hosting a former president, the current GOP frontrunner, for a town hall on his politics, his policy, with voters from an early primary state is essential, especially if you're not a media organization like Fox News or MSNBC. You're not a media organization where you just want to give one perspective to make your viewers have all the feel-good endorphins and chemicals going through their brain, coursing through their bodies. But if you're CNN, you want to provide the news with multiple perspectives. And I think it's absolutely imperative that if you're going to cover the GOP primary and you have the opportunity to have the GOP primary frontrunner and the unquestioned leader of the party on your show for an hour where you can ask them any questions, you got to do it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Where do you come down on this?
I mean, as you said, Justin, it really has been an incredible time for political media. Not only has Fox News been under a bigger amount of scrutiny and making more news of its own, more institutional news than at any time that I can really remember. But also we've got this show, Succession, a show all about political media heading into its finale. So there's been plenty of talk about Fox News, both for reasons that are happening in the real world and also for a fictional depiction of Fox News that's gotten so much attention. It's also at this time that, like you said, CNN have been coming under their own scrutiny because of their decision to air this town hall. And like you said, Justin, I agree with you that speaking to Trump, interviewing Trump is a newsworthy endeavor in a way because he's a significant person. You don't want to write off the opportunity to interview someone like that. But I do question the way that this was conducted. The first thing that I want to say, though, before we talk any more about this Trump town hall is to admit or acknowledge that I did not actually watch it. And I'm going to be giving some analysis of a program that I haven't seen. I'll explain why. But there was a movie podcast that had a premise like this, where they had two hosts, one who had watched the movie and one who hadn't. One who would only talk about the movie from what they had heard from the discourse, from the marketing, from the box office and critical reception, and so on. And so you got two perspectives. And that's kind of what we're going to have here, because we've got one person who, of course, is diligently consuming every bit of Trump media he can get his hands on. And then another one, me, who has opted out. And I can explain to you why I've done so. And I think that it reflects on the program and the concept of the program as well, which is that Trump has gotten a bit boring. You know, when he was president, Trump used to make news with everything that he said because he was the most powerful person in the world, and even ridiculous and absurd comments were newsworthy because they could affect the way things happen. I mean, he could make a comment and it would impact the stock market. Also, there was news that was related to him happening all the time. So every week there would be some new revelation or a policy or something. So there was always kind of new information happening in regard to Trump. But that's really changed. It really has. We've gone from a situation where everything that Trump said was newsworthy to a situation where nothing that he says is really interesting or newsworthy. And I think that's really the price of losing. Because when you're president, everything you say matters. And when you're just an angry old man living in Florida, almost nothing that you say is new, interesting, or too impactful. From what I've heard from reading the reception to this town hall, it sounds as though he's pretty much played the greatest hits, said the same stuff that he's been saying for month after month after month after month.
Well, John, before we get into it, I just want to make sure and remind our listeners, after the midterm elections, when Trump's candidates got shellacked and there was a large, almost agreement in the GOP establishment that they need to move on from Trump because he's such a damn loser. You and I had a podcast on who's going to win the GOP nominee. You took the DeSantis side, I took the Trump side, and we made a little wager about, either paying for one of us to go visit each other or paying for a nice little trip that we were going to take if we were living in close proximity to each other. So I just want to make sure that as we see DeSantis down 30, 40 points in every poll that we're talking about, that you didn't just tune out of Trump because of your despair about losing this bet, right?
I think, yeah, it's good that you've brought this up again. We'll remind the audience that, yes, we did make a bet. Justin has bet that Trump is going to be the GOP nominee. I bet that he wouldn't. Right now, Justin seems to be winning the bet based on the polls and other things we can observe. But as Justin is saying that I've chosen not to watch the town hall because of the bets, I will counter by pointing out that perhaps Justin's rosy-eyed analysis and assessment of Trump's performance again and again is perhaps colored by his own interest in winning this bet, which we all hope he is not placing ahead of his interest in providing quality analysis to our listeners, or indeed the interests of the country and the world.
The well-being of our republic.
Yeah, we don't want to see a situation where Justin finds himself cheering on Trump because he cares about this small dollar bet more than he does the fate of the republic.
Well, I think that this is actually important for a larger point. Of course, I'm partially colored by my priors that I've been making my assumptions on Trump and my knowledge of the GOP, but also this bet. Anybody discussing news or current events, John, has some personal bias. But no, it won't be coloring it that much because, and we'll do a totally different show on this. But you and I have been discussing this. I honestly, earnestly think that DeSantis is the better nominee now for Democrats to win. We'll just leave a cliffhanger there so that folks can kind of mull that over. But no, I just think that there's structural issues in part to how the media is going to cover Trump, has been covering Trump, has been covering DeSantis, that lend itself for this old, crazy insurrectionist to kind of lead himself to victory again.
Well, when you're talking about how the media are covering Trump, I mean, that kind of brings us back to the original question. I mean, we can get back to the substance of what was said and whether or not he really said anything newsworthy, because that's interesting. So we'll come back to that, especially because you actually watched the program, so you're in a position to comment on what was newsworthy. But let's take a minute to talk about how this was conducted. And I think that it was a matter of independent, discrete choices in format, in moderator, and so on. Because you can interview Trump, you can platform Trump, as they say, in lots of different ways. It's not just a decision to have him on television or not. He's probably going to find himself on television no matter what. And the news cycle has moved back to its Trumpian focus that it had drifted away from for a lot of 2021. But it's one decision to cover Trump and talk about Trump. It's another decision to interview Trump and have him on. And then it's another decision to do that live. It's another decision to do it with the moderator that they selected, which I'm not sure was the best choice. It's another decision to do it with a live audience. It's another decision to do it with a live audience in a town hall format. It's another decision to do that in New Hampshire and to do it with an audience that was stacked full of Republican voters. And as the governor of New Hampshire suggested, not just Republican voters, but committed Trump supporters. So we're on a string of lots of different decisions. You can focus on the decision to, as I say, platform Trump, but you're still not really getting to the string of decisions that were made by CNN. And I think some of them were not the best decisions.
And John, just to follow up on that, I think that we will have disagreements over the types of formats that should have been done, because I do think a town hall format is great. I agree the moderator wasn't good. I agree that it wasn't executed properly because you had a lot of appearing seemingly Trump sycophants in the audience. However, John, I think everything that you just touched on, where you and others have valid criticisms, point to one thing. Trump held all the cards here. right? At least from my perspective, the reading I've done, just the way that they set this up, it really did sound like CNN had been trying to get Trump on for a while. Trump's team was pushing him to go onto more mainstream media outlets. And apparently he's going to do another media blitz with interviews, and maybe they're taped and not live, moving forward with more mainstream outlets. But CNN was thirsty for the ratings to get Trump back on. So therefore, I think they had to agree to certain conditions that they otherwise wouldn't have. And I want to point out maybe the moderator, and also not the format. I love town hall formats. I love doing it in New Hampshire, obviously, but the composition of the audience. So I think that Trump may have picked Caitlin Collins because she's relatively inexperienced in this type of setting. She's also, I would argue, relatively conservative in her personal views, or at least the way that she is able to understand information and then give that information to the audience. And also, lastly, the audience members that they had in there, CNN was saying, oh, these are independents or folks going to vote in the Republican primary, Republicans. Number one, New Hampshire's an open primary system. So you can have Democrats, you can have independents, you can have anyone vote in the primary. Number two, and you know this quote as well as I do, they had Governor Chris Sununu on MSNBC getting interviewed by Jen Psaki, the former White House the former White House press secretary. And he said these weren't Republican voters in New Hampshire. He said they weren't independents. He said they were card-carrying MAGA members. So that is all to say, the fact that you had a weak and inexperienced moderator and combine that with a crowd that was very clearly on Trump's side. Anytime he said anything, they'd clap. Anytime he made what he appeared and thought was a joke, they'd laugh. That changes the tone and tenor of the event to be much more favorable for Trump than it should be, considering the crazy shit he was saying.
So, I mean, again, we've got lots of different choices here that we can look at. Let's start just by talking about what was the purpose of this program, because that has to inform all the decisions that you're making as a media programmer, right? So, based on what they've done, it seems like the purpose of it was entertainment, to get ratings, to get attention, and to set up for the primary, the primary contest.
And you'd think, John, just to add in one thing here, you'd think virtue signaling to a conservative audience to try and build out a new type of viewer that you may not have had access to without Trump would also be in there.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. As we know, CNN are under new ownership, under new leadership after the merger with Discovery. CNN is part of Warner Brothers. Time Warner were owned by AT&T until recently, when there was a deal to spin off all of the entertainment products under the Warner umbrella and merge them with Discovery. And Discovery's leadership came in and kind of became the new brain trust of the combined company. Discovery are a company that I have personal experience working with when I was co-creating and helping to manage a TV channel over in the Middle East. I kind of have an idea for the way they think, which is very commercial. It's not always focused on making programming that's going to stand the test of time. It's usually about spending as little money as you can and turning around for a quick buck. That's kind of the mindset. They've also sacked Jeff Zucker, who was the head of CNN for, I think, almost about a decade, if not more. Don't have the years in front of me. But he was someone who had taken CNN in kind of a progressive liberal direction with its orientation during the Trump years. And he's been replaced with a gentleman named Chris Licht, who has said that he wants CNN to regain its centrist credentials, when CNN was known before the Trump years mostly just as a place to get live news, to get breaking news, impartial, just associated really with the term news rather than with one side of the aisle or the other. So yeah, it seems like this was definitely part of why they wanted to have Trump on, to show that they were going to be a platform for the entire political spectrum, to have discussion and audience with Republican primary voters just as much as they would with Democrats. But I question whether it really makes sense in May of 2023 to be hosting a program based on the premise of the presidential primary, because the primary hasn't really started. There's been a lot of talk about it as if it's underway, but we're still almost a year out from when New Hampshire votes. So is the purpose of bringing Trump on television now, to set up for primary voting, or should it just be about news gathering? Especially given what's been going on with him lately. He's been indicted. There was also the judgment in that E. Jean Carroll case where he was found guilty of sexual abuse, or I should say liable for sexual abuse and defamation. I mean, and we're still, like I said, a year out from the primary almost. I think, 9 months at this point? Maybe a little less than that. But we're far out from the primary. So most of the other candidates haven't even declared. There's been no debates. Why are we doing a primary town hall for a live audience in New Hampshire?
We've been experiencing this since I graduated college and moved down to DC in 2013. John, the primaries have been moving earlier and earlier and earlier. And while I take your point that we are, 6 months out from the Iowa, well, more than that, like probably 7, 8, 9 months out from the Iowa caucuses. I can't find the date right now. I don't know if that matters as much as when these candidates are declaring. So obviously Trump declared, and we agree on this. The criminal Trump declared early so that when he was indicted, and it will be indicted moving forward, he can claim, oh, this is a witch hunt. This is political. They're all indicting me because I'm a candidate, which is complete bullshit. So putting that aside, though, you do see candidates either having announced, I believe Nikki Haley being the one serious person that is announced, or folks getting ready to announce. So Tim Scott, he's getting ready to announce. He just made a big hire. He's about to, supposedly announce coming up here in a couple of weeks. You had Ron DeSantis. He originally said he was going to announce now in mid-May before he started sinking in the polls and people started to understand who he really is and how odd of a person he is. So that is to say, I don't know if the date of the primary or the caucus matters as much as when the main contestants are in. And you do have Haley, you do have Trump. Mike Pence is going around doing interviews on CNN. You have Tim Scott, like I mentioned, and DeSantis. He really is already running. He was in Iowa the other day. He's been meeting with large donors. He's been going to all the events that you would expect a presidential candidate to run on. So if you're running a presidential campaign, but you're just not calling it a presidential campaign, I'd argue you are campaigning. And that's enough of a critical mass from my perspective to say that this is primary season right now.
Justin, you and I are both from New Hampshire. The people of New Hampshire are so unbelievably spoiled. And the earlier the primary calendar moves, the more spoiled the people of New Hampshire are.
The better.
There's been so much discussion about this in the last few years. And I think the Democrats are moving away from the recent primary structure where New Hampshire and Iowa get all of this special attention. The Republicans aren't yet, and they might not. But there's a lot of talk about how New Hampshire is an improper place to hold the first primary because it's not very diverse. Another matter is just the amount of media attention, the amount of issue prioritization, and the amount of campaign investment that comes into the state on account of them voting first. This town hall is an excellent example. We've talked about how Trump couldn't come on CNN for a while until he got everything he wanted. CNN perhaps chasing him around. The audience with this person is sort of a rare opportunity for CNN, but also for this audience, this live audience that got to be there and ask questions of him and share that space and get their issues and their perspectives featured on television during the Q&A parts of this town hall. Here are the people of New Hampshire, something like 8 or 9 months ahead of the primary, getting this opportunity. The earlier the primary calendar moves and the more we treat the New Hampshire primary like it's going on, the more and more advantage this particular set of voters are getting. And here they are for almost a year being treated like it's their primary season. How long is it going to be the California primary season? How long is it going to be the Texas primary season? These states that have tens of millions of voters, they're going to get about 2 or 3 days where it's their time to ask questions of these candidates. And here we have the people of New Hampshire being able to do so for months and months and months ahead of the actual voting.
Well, as somebody from New England, I would say, thank God it's never primary season in California, because for the Democrats, it's usually always wrapped up well before California makes their selection on the ballot. And the Republican primary has made some rule changes to support, potentially make it easier for President Trump to get elected by making it more winner take all states. So potentially it will never be California primary season in 2024. But I do want to get back to what we were discussing. I think we can both agree on the moderator. And having watched the debate, she was trying hard. She was trying. So Trump would make a comment about, I don't know, the rigged election. And for the first 10 minutes, every time she'd do that, she would either interrupt him, stop him, or fact check him afterwards and say, Mr. President, you know that's not true. And she would do that for a lot of issues. The problem is Caitlin Collins doesn't have the experience, the gravitas, or maybe the acumen to approach an interview in a way that I'm going to list three people here, John, that are all very different styles, but ultimately can control a room no matter who they are interviewing. Somebody like John Dickerson, who takes a softer approach to an interview, but he can ask that incisive question and catch you off guard. Somebody like Jonathan Swan, who, is coy, but clearly has a combative streak to him, or Jake Tapper. Those are the three that come to mind. I think Leslie Stahl should be included in this, because when she interviewed President Trump, he ended up getting up and standing out. So that is just to say, because the interviewer, Caitlin Collins, who appears to be a left-wing media darling, which I don't get. She's done some really bad stuff at the Daily Caller. That's an aside. But I think that because of her failings and just inability and inexperience, basically, Trump was able to run over her roughshod. And in addition to that dynamic, you had this pro-Trump crowd like we were talking about. And every time he would run over her, or every time he would say something crass, they would be putting gasoline on the fire, because they'd all be smiling, they'd be clapping, they'd be laughing, they'd be cheering him on. So it was almost like there was a freight train going downhill. Caitlin Collins is trying to put brakes on this freight train. And then the audience is just like, no. We got to step on the gas. Let's get some more Trump. So I think those two things alone undermined the endeavor and made it not like neutral news, but more WWE wrestling, where Trump, for many, came out on top.
Yeah, Justin, you mentioned that perhaps the Trump team requested that Caitlin Collins would be the moderator, or at least were happy to have her chosen as the moderator. CNN have a number of other people who are more experienced who could have done it. Jake Tapper, you mentioned, also Anderson Cooper, Chris Wallace, who now works for CNN. These are all people who are known for conducting interviews. And I think that maybe a lot of the reason why Caitlin Collins was chosen, like you said, it could have been because of the preference of the Trump side, but also CNN are interested in developing her into one of their key personalities. There's talk that she's going to be the headliner of their new primetime programming schedule. Also, she's quite young. Like you said, she's known for not necessarily being on the left politically. She was a writer at the Daily Caller, which was a conservative internet outlet that was started by Tucker Carlson.
No, John. It's a trash outlet started by Tucker Carlson. One of her articles that she wrote was, this is in the middle of the Syrian refugee crisis, and when it was a flashpoint in the United States, I think 2015, she wrote an article ranking Syrian refugees on their attractiveness and whether or not we would accept them into the United States based on the way they looked, which is, for anybody that understands the gravity of people trying to flee a war-torn area where one person is using chemical weapons against women and children, and it's door-to-door, neighbor against neighbor fighting, the most gruesome thing you can think of. She is making light of it, and she's not doing it like in a one-off comment, John, on a podcast or on live TV. She came up with this idea, or somebody gave her this idea. She thought about it. She thought it was a good idea. She then wrote it and worked to publish it. So that being said, I don't care how old she was. That is something that is crossing a line that is so red in the sand, much more red than the line that Obama put down in Syria that he never enforced. But just that type of article, and I could say this, I was working on propaganda for the RNC around a similar time. I never did anything that bad. And I wasn't a quote unquote independent journalist. So let's just put Kate, I have strong feelings on this. Let's just put her in context for somebody that has the judgment to do something as disgusting as that.
It really was of a piece with what the Daily Caller were publishing around that time. They were not the National Review or the Weekly Standard. They were a little sleazier. It was a lot of, bikinis and slideshows with pictures of women, full banner ads everywhere. It was not a classy operation. And that was how she got her start in journalism. But then she went to CNN. She became an on-air personality with them. I think that there were a few incidents during the Trump years when she was a White House correspondent where she got in tiffs with the Trump press shop. And it seemed as though maybe she was building credentials that gave her credibility on the other side of the aisle, or certainly at least in the center. So I understand why Chris Licht and this new regime want to elevate her, because maybe she's seen as having the credibility on both sides of the aisle if they're looking for these down the middle newsreaders and to rebuild that kind of brand. Whereas Tapper and Anderson Cooper and some others are maybe a little bit more well known for being on the liberal side of the spectrum. But the thing is, even if you believe that she's going to be your next gen talent, you have to ask whether she's ready for a program like this one, because this guy, Donald Trump, is one of the most difficult interviews that you can conduct. It's a truly very, very difficult interview. We've named a few people who have done it well, but you can name many more who have not. And I don't really recall her ever conducting a memorable or impressive interview. Maybe there has been one that I just am not aware of, but when I think on my experiences with Kaitlan Collins on television, I think about her reading the news. I think about her in the White House press gallery. I do not really recall any significant interview occasions or experiences. So I think that for an interview this difficult, it is an unusual choice and perhaps not a wise one. When we also consider how stacked that audience was, like you said, that makes the degree of difficulty even higher. But I think there's also a tendency in U.S. media to have a bit of deference towards powerful and significant people that you don't necessarily see in some of the international media, even the English language media. When I watch political news from the UK, I see the opposite. I see this kind of combativeness on behalf of the interviewers that maybe even is too far in the other direction, or sometimes it crosses into rude and abrasive. But I can think of people like Jeremy Paxman, Andrew Neil, Stephen Sacker, who are known for giving these really hard-hitting interviews where there's no deference at all to the powerful people, where you're not calling them Mr. President and Sir all the time, where your goal is really to hold their feet to the fire and put them under pressure. CNN took such a different approach with this. Not only was she calling him Mr. President every time, but in the studio, when they went back to show the pundits, they had the presidential seal showing in the middle of the stage. I mean, it's elevating this person as a former president with that kind of pageantry. President for life, almost. It's not holding them to scrutiny as a peer, but instead holding them up on a higher level.
To your last point, this is a little word association, but them showing that seal like that and calling him Mr. President, it plays into his claim that he is the president, right? Because he's not admitting that he lost in 2020. So it's almost giving some legitimacy to his outlandish lies that literally put the state of this republic at risk. But I do want to tweak what you just said a little bit. And I agree. I don't watch as much UK or international media as you, don't have that experience. However, I would argue, just to reframe it a little bit, I would say in the US, they're very respectful and very deferential, unless you're going on a network that has a different partisan bent than you. And specifically, I think of interviews on Fox News, where you see Pete Buttigieg, for example, go on and answer these very difficult questions. They don't give him too much time, although he's staying on topic, generally speaking. I think of now, I think we may have different views on this. I really don't like this. I think of MSNBC and Mehdi Hassan and the way that he accosts and attacks people that he doesn't agree with, yet is very fawning over people that he does agree with. And I think that that is how our media kind of approaches things. But to your point, maybe it is something culturally where if you're trying to play it down the middle and you have a pathological liar who is literally putting himself over everything, maybe there is a cultural aspect there.
Yeah. So Mehdi, who you mentioned, although he's an American now, he was for much of his life British and came up through the international media. He went to school in Britain, was part of the debating society there too. So I think perhaps he is bringing a little bit of that cultural attitude to the way he conducts interviews here. I think that there is a bit more crosstalk in some of those interviews than I would prefer, and more than I see on the shows I mentioned. Stephen Sacker, Andrew Neil. If you watch their interviews, you don't see much crosstalk. I think that that's an exceptionally difficult thing to accomplish. You mentioned when Pete Buttigieg goes on Fox. Often he goes on Fox News Sunday and the programs that are hosted by Bret Baier. I think Bret Baier is a pretty good interviewer who often seems to be playing it pretty fair. I think that some of the exposures that came from the Dominion lawsuit have really hit at that reputation and showed that maybe behind the scenes he's not as even keeled and even handed as he seems on television, which is unfortunate. But I think that, they do a pretty good job on that program of bringing on people of different views and kind of investigating them in a serious way. Speaking of these different programs, the different formats, let's go back a little bit to talking about this town hall thing, because we're comparing all these different interview styles. But when we are thinking of these memorable interviews, we're thinking about two cameras or a remote link. We're thinking about a person speaking to another person and pushing them and getting answers where they can. What significant, memorable interviews have you seen take a format like the one that we saw the other night? I mean, forget about the UK media. Think about the major interviews that we've seen in the American media on 60 Minutes, or on some of the ones that have been conducted by Oprah Winfrey, who's one of the best American interviewers. Usually, these are conducted with two chairs and two cameras without an audience. I can't really think of maybe the one where Tom Cruise is jumping on the couch, but too many great interviews that have been conducted in a format like the one that we saw with live audience participation. It just doesn't seem to be that conducive to a serious sit down.
Do you not, God rest this man's soul, have you never watched Jerry Springer and the great interviews he used to conduct?
Were those even interviews?
It was scripted TV reality, like with the worst white trash you could get, like three girls and a dude, and then they would have questions at the end by the audience.
My brother went to a taping of that program, actually. But yeah, it wasn't as much an interview as much as setting up some kind of combat between multiple live participants. That I think he was the mayor of Cleveland or Cincinnati. Yeah.
Cincinnati.
I mean, there's an alternate timeline where he becomes president instead of Donald Trump.
He's Trump.
Yeah.
No, to your point, dude, I think you're right that it's very difficult to have that serious, solemn tone out of a setting where it's not one-on-one, because as we talk about Dickerson or Swan, let's leave it there. The way that they tend to approach these interviews is they ask questions to set up their narrative and basically give the guest as much rope as they need to hang themselves. And then they ask them that incisive question, or with Jonathan's perspective, they give them that fact, right? And I've seen him do that with Trump. I saw him do it with Rashida Tlaib. He does it with, it's a travesty that he's not still interviewing people. However, there is a way to do it. Personally, the town hall for me is my preferred political format, right? I guess you could make an argument before we get into the town hall that the debate stage where you have a moderator asking a question in front of a live audience, there's been some memorable moments there where Megyn Kelly asked Trump something that he took offense to and then he freaked out on her. So I think it can be done. I think the reason why town halls are so important is this is the preferred medium to understand what voters are interested in and how the politicians interact with those voters, and then ultimately their policy points and why, right? So members of Congress, the House, the Senate, usually governors do this a lot. We saw this, John, growing up in New Hampshire. Every presidential candidate would host their own town halls. Now, the format's a bit different, right? They give a speech for 15, 20 minutes or whatever, and then they do, 15, 40 minutes of questions from the audience. And I think that that is very valuable because in any town hall in New Hampshire, which is another reason how CNN kind of fucked this format up, you're going to get questions from people who do not agree with the person that is giving the discussion. They're doing fact finding. They're trying to learn more. They just vehemently disagree with these policies. However, the essence of the town hall to me is really getting to feel and see the interaction between the voter and the politician. And for that reason, I absolutely loved the format. I just think that they picked a bad moderator and they set her up to fail by stacking the audience. And last thing here, John, is we've seen Trump give one-on-one interviews 100 times. We haven't really seen that many town halls.
I think you put your finger on something important, and we've been talking about this kind of throughout this conversation, but the makeup of the audience, the composition of the audience. There's a program in Britain, again, called Question Time, one of their flagship programs, sort of the equivalent to Meet the Press in a way, where you've got a panel of people. It's usually one member of the Tory party, one member of the Labour Party, and then maybe a journalist, maybe a celebrity, 4 or 5 people.
So Labour, Tory, Democrat, Republican, for example, in the States.
Yeah. The major center-left party, the major center-right party. And they travel around the country and they set up these audience question programs in different towns, in different locations. And one of the keys to the program is that audience composition factor. What they try to do is build a demographic sample that represents the place that they're at. And it's the balance of partisan alignment in that location. It's age, it's other demographic categories. They try to show on a microcosm what the people of that town or city represent. And so it's never all one side or the other, but you'll see sometimes the special interests of that location come through. In the South, they care about crossing of the channel.
Or like, for example, in the Midwest in the United States, they care about agriculture. In Maine, they care about lobsters.
Exactly. What they did here was not that. They didn't show you what New Hampshire thinks. Because New Hampshire is a very divided state politically. It could be an interesting state to get a demographic sample of in an audience. About 30% Democrat, 30% Republican, and 30% independent, maybe leaning one way or the other, with some college students, with people who work in various representative industries, and so on. That's not what they did. They stacked it with Trump supporters. They didn't show you what the people in New Hampshire think. They show you what the people in Donald Trump's supportive audience think. And that's part of why I don't think that we are going to learn very much from this kind of program. Part of why I didn't have that much interest in watching it, because I think we already know what Trump supporters think of Trump. And we know how comfortable he is interacting with them. And often the way he's interacted with those sorts of people is, again, repeating the same things again and again and again. So we know we're going to get that. What are we learning here?
Yeah, so I just want to really put a fine point on what you said. I will never forget this. I almost remember it like verbatim. A younger gentleman, not a bad looking guy, gets up there, asks President Trump a question, says he's a military veteran, says he started his own small business. It's an aviation company. And, obviously Trump immediately offers him a job, saying he wants good people in his administration. And then the gentleman asks, we see Governor Ron DeSantis using the government to attack businesses. I'm a conservative. I believe in the free market. One of my biggest fears is the government infringing on my personal business. What are you going to do to protect me from the government? And obviously Trump just loved that. I think one thing we did learn, though, in this question kind of symbolizes it, is throughout this whole event, the way that Trump postured and the way that Trump positioned himself was he didn't even mention Ron DeSantis. Maybe once he mentioned it at the beginning of this question, but the way that he went about answering all the questions, sure, John, you're right. It was largely Trump's greatest hits. He was rambling like he was on Adderall. He was not making sense a lot, and he was focusing on the last election. However, The strategy he used was, and I don't want to say presidential, but he's trying to position himself as the unquestioned nominee. And he basically ignored Ron DeSantis. He ignored everything Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, the way that Ron's like trying to like slyly attack him. And he just went after Biden. So from that perspective, and maybe this is just interesting to you and me, or maybe just me, I think we saw the political strategy that Trump, at least right now, is going to take with Ron DeSantis when he's in a mainstream audience, when he has an audience that is not just the right-wing media ecosystem. He's going to largely try and act what Trump thinks is presidential, ignore DeSantis to belittle him and position himself against Biden so that people think about Trump versus Biden. And that is one thing I learned during this town hall, that he had at least enough restraint to not just completely spend all of his time bashing DeSantis. And that was interesting.
You know, it's kind of funny you say that. And maybe I'm learning something about how he conducted himself in this program because, again, I didn't actually watch it. But it's interesting because that's pretty much the opposite of my perception of how Trump and DeSantis have conducted themselves so far during this, you know, quote unquote primary cycle that hasn't actually begun yet. The pre-primary cycle. But my perception has been that Trump is much more willing to be direct about DeSantis and criticize him publicly in very mean-spirited and antagonistic ways than DeSantis is. That is actually DeSantis who's reluctant to mention Trump, acknowledge Trump, engage with Trump, and it's Trump that's willing to do so. So it's interesting to note that on television, he might have taken the opposite.
That's accurate. And I do want to say a lot of Trump's attacks on DeSantis are accurate in of themselves, even if they are mean. However, when Trump has done that, it's been on Truth Social, which is his little ecosystem, his, you know, echo chamber. It's been a 1 or 2 lines at a rally that he's hosted around his voters, or, you know, it's been a line at an event. The media has largely mischaracterized this from my perspective, but generally speaking, you're right. DeSantis hasn't like come out and said anything explicitly against Trump. He made a comment about, like how he doesn't hire hookers, I think. And then he came out and made another comment recently about how the GOP needs to get past the losers and they've lost so much that they need to get past that. But really, Trump did kind of take the DeSantis approach in this town hall, and it's going to work for Trump much better than it is DeSantis, because if you're trying to make up ground against a competitor, you've got to sling the mud.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this question about the extent to which Trump cares at all about persuading people who aren't already part of his group. He really feeds off the psychopathy or psychopanthy, whatever the correct noun version is here. Pardon me if I'm saying the wrong word, but he feeds off of the adulation from these crowds, and not just the crowd in the audience, not just the crowd on the pseudo Twitter that he set up where he only needs to interact with people of his own faction, but also inside of his staff, inside of his family. He seeks out the adulation. And does he care at all about persuading people who aren't already on his team? And this is the struggle for the Republican Party. If you have a candidate who's not interested in persuading people who haven't already decided that they're obsessed with him, how are you going to win another election? That's the trouble.
Well, he's delusional, right? So I'd argue Ron DeSantis is delusional for getting into this race. I think Trump is delusional in that he thinks he can persuade everybody by being himself. And during the town hall, just to get back to like the interesting tics that I heard Trump verbally doing, and maybe it'll, add a different angle to this, is when he was asked a question, again, he did all the crazy shit, like rambling and acting like Trump. However, there were times where he would catch himself, and maybe this was an affect that he was doing purposefully to give off the perception that I'm about to explain. He would catch himself and be like, oh, I got to be truthful. And he would say it out loud. Oh, I got to be truthful. I got to be truthful. So, for example, one instance he did this was he was asked about the debt ceiling, and this made news. And he basically said, we need to default. And then Caitlin Collins tried to act tough and followed up. But Mr. President, during your term, 3 times there was a clean debt limit passed. why are you all of a sudden flipping? And then he smiles and laughs and he goes, well, because I'm not president anymore. And the audience just erupted. So that is to say, Caitlin Collins didn't follow up and didn't hold him to task on that, which is very poor form by the moderator. But also, the way that he went into this was he was trying to give off the perception of being restrained and presidential, because there were a few other times he said, well, truthfully, and he'd like kind of backtrack a little bit and try and give off the perception that he was trying to restrain himself and come off as presidential. And to your point, in his mind, he probably believes, well, if I just do the same stuff but pretends to care, I'll persuade more people because they'll believe I'm more constrained. But also, John, just by him going out of the conservative media ecosystem, Ron DeSantis has not stepped out and done mainstream media. When Ron DeSantis does step out and do mainstream media, he's going to crash and burn because he's a miserable asshole and he hates being asked tough questions. So Trump doing the CNN town hall, I don't know if it was necessarily to persuade, although he probably thinks in his own mind it was because he's a little bit warped. I think what he was trying to do is suck up all of the media attention so that the moderates who are not really interested in Trump, they like Trump, but they don't like the baggage, so that he's able to just monopolize all the media attention in outlets that they're more likely to gravitate towards. And potentially he's going to consolidate those votes, maybe not out of persuasion, but out of a sense of inevitability. If Trump is out there in these media situations, he's doing relatively well for what he normally does. Why would I look at DeSantis when getting this primary over quicker is the best way to beat Joe Biden? So maybe that was some of the approach there.
I mean, you're definitely right that there's a significant difference between Trump and DeSantis in their preparation to engage with the national media. DeSantis has been very reluctant to engage at all with media outside of his friendly circles. If you see him on television, if you see him in his encounters under the national spotlight, he doesn't really seem too prepared to be on TV. Trump, of course, is the opposite. He spent decades as a reality television star. He's got more experience being on camera on the national stage than almost anyone in American history. But with that in mind, I mean, you're talking about how he's thus prepared to go into unfriendly media environments. With that in mind, it kind of brings us back to what we were saying here at the beginning, which was we're intuiting by the choices that CNN made that perhaps Trump would only have agreed to give them this airtime if they had a friendly environment, friendly moderator, on and on and on. You know, given that Trump does have so much experience in the media, including with antagonistic media, perhaps it would have been possible to get Trump to go on in an environment that was a little bit better for news value, a little bit better for CNN's own prestige and standing, a little bit better for us to learn things about him and his supposed campaign than what we got. I was thinking back, and I'm interested to maybe get your take on this, Justin, because of your experience with political communication. I have experience in the media, but not as much on the political communication side. I remember when I was a lowly intern at a congressional office, it was a Republican office. They invited me to give a try at writing constituent issue letters when we would get mail from constituents. And New Hampshire, very divided state, we were about 50-50 in our district between Republicans and Democrats. So we would get letters from both sides on the big issues. And so I had to try writing issues for the people who were opposed to the position that we took and those who supported it. And I had very different approaches where for the people who opposed our position, I took a information persuasive approach where I put in the data and the stats. And I tried to explain the position that the congressman was taking in a way that seemed reasonable and might actually change a mind. But when I was writing the one for the people who support the position, I just put in the quote unquote red meat, the talking points that we knew that people of his political faction might applaud intuitively because they were the common arguments from that side. And the people who worked at the office said that generally this was the right approach.
I think as an intern, that's a brilliant approach to take. And I think
as an intern,
no, like thinking about it from that perspective and generally speaking, you're right? I do want to add in though. So you're talking about a moderate district. I worked in an R+20 district with somebody who was a House Freedom Caucus member. So what we would do is, with the exception of like a big letter or a big issue, right? We would teach the LAs to give the red meat to the people that agree with us. And for the folks that don't agree with us, tell them to fuck off. And that was pretty much, very short letters saying, I'm sorry, my position is X, Y, and Z, and basically reiterate why they were writing into the office. So I don't want to interrupt your train of thought here, but it's a very, very different approach.
Well, yeah. I mean, that feeds back into what we're talking about, though, with Trump and his recent political communication on this town hall and otherwise, where he's only taking this red meat approach, right? He's completely given up on the other approach. So I described how in a moderate district, you tried a little bit of both, where you gave the red meat to the supporters and you gave the informative and explanatory, perhaps persuasive approach to the people on the other side. And if you're in a R+20 district, you can just do red meat only. Well, Trump's doing red meat only, and the United States is not R+20. Neither even is the state of New Hampshire.
It's like D+3.
And if you're going to run a candidate that pretends that it's all R+20, you have really given up on persuading the true electorate, which is, if anything, D+3.
You know what Trump has going for him, and we should get back to the town hall, or at least media, because we'll do tons of these shows on Trump and DeSantis. And I'm saying that because I'm parroting your critique, John. I always want to get into the horse race. I always want to talk about Trump DeSantis. Problem is, dude, it's only red meat candidates on the GOP primary, right? DeSantis isn't trying to, nor could he persuade anybody. Maybe Nikki Haley could, but she's come out in favor of like a 6-week national abortion ban. So I think that the Republican Party finds itself in a very different position than the Democratic Party did. It's homogeneous, dude. They're all fighting for who can give up the most red meat, as opposed to, for example, the wide ideological differences during the Democratic primary. You had Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren on one side. You had Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg on the other side. And then standing next to Assad, you had Tulsi Gabbard. Like, you had a run of, and then Marianne Williamson, who probably needs to be checked into an asylum. So you had a wide range of personalities and ideologies, and it resulted in the best candidate for a general election coming out. To your point, though, on the GOP side, and the media is just going to have to figure out a way to cover this. It's all red meat all the time.
Yeah, Justin, I remember in 2016, the Democratic primary was made up entirely of people who used to be Republicans. It was Jim Webb, Lincoln Chafee, Hillary Clinton, who famously campaigned for Barry Goldwater. And then there was Bernie Sanders, who has never been a member of the Democratic Party.
And Elizabeth Warren was thinking about getting in, and she became a Democrat in 94.
I think the only lifelong Democrat that was on the stage was Martin O'Malley, of all of them. Anyway, yes, the party's a little bit different that way. And on the Republican side, it seems like, it's mostly going to be true believers. And then Trump, who has been here and there, but as we all know, has his...
Well, he was a friggin' Democrat, John.
Yeah.
So it was the inverse, right? You just list off all the Democrats that were Republicans. This guy's a Republican. But let's get back to it, right? So I think unquestionably Trump benefited from this exercise for the GOP primary. However, I think, like we started off, a news organization has a responsibility to show different perspectives, different sides, different points of view. And in the long run, I think that the opposition research material given during this event in a town hall setting will come back to help Democrats. They'll be able to cut this up. They'll be able to run commercials whenever they so choose. They probably won't do it during the campaign, for the primary rather, because it sounds like they want Trump to win. But they have this ammunition now just absolutely sitting there. But ultimately, that's why I think it was good. Any sane person that's not a partisan, that's not worried about their bottom line and their tax brackets over the well-being of others in society who aren't social conservatives, are going to view the town hall event. And maybe they don't remember it in November when it's time to vote, 16 months from now, or however long that is, but 18 months from now. However, John, they're basically, like you said, Trump has been missing in action. So since the insurrection, this is really their first time seeing President Trump again, former President Trump. And he's still the raving lunatic that he always was. So it's, consolidated those suburban voters. And it's just another point in human psychology, another proof point that this guy's not well. He's not moderate. He doesn't give a shit about you. And it's kind of cementing these priors for a lot of these independent, suburban, Republican leaning women. And I think that value is massive, outweighs the cons.
This is not the first time that we've seen Trump on television since the insurrection. That's certainly not the case. We've seen him in friendly interviews, and we've seen him at rallies. This could have been different from those, but in the end, it was not so different, was it? It was like a friendly interview or like a rally. If CNN had organized this differently, maybe it would have been a little bit more unique. But it was an opportunity that was perhaps not seized with that in mind. But I also just want to kind of question whether it's really so valuable to show that Trump's a little nutty and that he has right-wing beliefs on these issues, or that this could be useful to cut into a campaign ad from a Democratic perspective, because none of that is new. And the problem and the challenge has never been a lack of material that demonstrates that Trump is dangerous or has extreme beliefs or is an unhinged personality. There's never been a lack of material in that regard, ever. In fact, there's been too much of it. And that was the strategy, the deliberate strategy that Steve Bannon famously articulated when he said, we'll win by flooding the zone with shit. If there's too many things to focus on, if there's too many things to object to, you can't be very targeted. And it's made it actually, in some ways, more difficult to make a clear case for why Trump is dangerous when there's so much stuff to point to. With other candidates, often it's been easy to point to one particular failing, one particular controversy in a focused way to demonstrate why that person should be disqualified from consideration as a political candidate. But with Trump, it's hard to point to just one thing because there's always been so much. I mean, after the insurrection, the most important thing to focus on when criticizing Trump became pretty clear. That's, again, why I would question whether there was a lot of value for the Democrats from whatever he said the other night. And again, I would also just go back to what I've been saying the whole time, which is to question whether any of this is new or newsworthy.
No, none of it was new. I do think it's newsworthy, maybe because of the messenger. I do want to just, this is giving your point credence, I guess. So they discussed a wide range of topics. And like you just said, Steve Bannon basically said one of the tenets of propaganda is when questioned or they have you by the neck, so to speak, flood the zone and obfuscate, right? There are other principles: create your own reality, repetition, virtue signaling, divide and conquer. But that obfuscation is a critical component of basically responding to legitimate criticisms. During the town hall, John, they asked him about his indictments they asked him about the E. Jean Carroll case. They asked him about the New York indictment. They asked him about a very likely indictment down in Georgia, and he said some terrible things for all of these. They didn't even get to, John, the dinner at Mar-a-Lago that he had with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, two Nazis. And that just goes to your point. They had him for like 70 minutes. They didn't even ask him about one of the most disgusting and damning things he's done in recent history. So maybe there is some credence to that. The only pushback that I would give you is then if that's the case, if we agree that this guy's maybe quote unquote Teflon with his certain group of voters and that flooding the zone is part of it, then to deal with this in an appropriate and adult manner, there would almost need to be a media blackout of him. And I don't think that is going to happen. So short of almost some type of collusion to censor him from mainstream media, which I'm not saying is a bad idea, actually, I think that it's better to show him more often, especially in settings that aren't to his favor, although this town hall turned out to be kind of a mess because it was to his favor.
If we look at the E. Jean Carroll case as the significant development that's happened since the last time we heard from Trump in this kind of a setting. We could see some value in a focused, targeted, sit-down interview with one interviewer who asks him questions about the E. Jean Carroll case. That's not what we got at all.
Well, the other newsworthy thing is I've heard him give. So the stump speeches, dude, the speeches that he gives in front of his crowds, those are the things that I now tune out. But I've seen clips, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of those. And he was in a lot of these clips demonstrably mentally diminished. He was slurring his words. He was talking slower. He was making even less sense than normal. So I watched this town hall in large part, obviously, because Trump is entertaining and it's like the value of the car crash, the train crash, the plane crash. You want to see the explosion. But also, I thought that ultimately he was going to be a diminished type of candidate. And he came out, again, prefacing it, saying crazy stuff. But his words were crisp and he was speaking quick and he was still steamrolling and bulldozing everybody. So from that perspective, I think it was interesting to see, reintroduction onto the national stage in an arena that wasn't Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, or any of those crazies, just to see his ability to handle these questions. Was he going to come out and just be dour and sad? No, he was kind of personable, kind of like mucking it up with the audience. So just to get a gut check on where he is as a potential candidate. And it was closer to Trump of 2016 without the novelty than, the end of the 2022 campaign.
Without the novelty, that's the key caveat. And that's what I keep coming back to, Justin. We talked about this when we made our bets. And something that I observed, and I still strongly believe, is that a lot of the fascination and entertainment value around Trump's candidacy in 2016 was that it was so unusual. It was not like anything that we'd seen in recent American history from a political campaign, especially a presidential campaign. But that's not the case anymore. Now, not only is Trump saying the same thing all the time, but so many of these other Republicans are trying to sound like him. We've heard this stuff again and again and again and again and again. And that's why it's not so newsworthy unless you're very precise, you're really ready to ask original questions and come back with follow-ups and hold his feet on an issue that he hasn't properly answered for. That's not what we got at all, from what I understand, having not watched it. Having read analysis, seen clips, heard your characterization of what happened. Instead, we gave him an opportunity to say the same things he said a million times. And as he repeats himself, as other candidates try to imitate him, it just becomes less and less and less interesting, less and less and less entertaining.
So, John, I wanted to ask you this like 20, 30 minutes ago. We know where I stand. I love the town hall format. I think that they botched the audience and they botched the interviewer. If you were to do an interview like this with Trump, you had a magic wand, you could determine how to do this in the best way possible. And I'm going to put a constraint on you. You can't do a one-on-one interview, okay? It has to be some type of audience, live audience there. How would you approach it? What would be your format? What would you do differently? Why do you think what you're going to propose would succeed?
Why does there have to be a live audience? That's a bizarre criteria. Most interviews are not conducted with a live audience. It's an unusual choice to make. So it's a very strange constraint.
Let's just say it was a constraint that Trump insisted on, a live taping with an audience.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. Why don't you put a lot of families who voted for Biden and had family members who died of COVID and have them ask him questions?
Let's just pull the audience aside. What would be your ideal format for this type of interview then?
Well, I said a few minutes ago, I think that if we judge the new newsworthy element in regard to Trump that's taken place since his last interview as having been the verdict in that E. Jean Carroll case, let's put Trump in a sit-down one-on-one interview with a tough female journalist and have him answer questions only about that case.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something. His hatred of women, it comes across when he's talking to a woman. he called Caitlin Collins a nasty person. So maybe that is the way to go about it. A one-on-one with a tough female interviewer.
Let's have Oprah Winfrey interview him for 30 minutes
Oh, God.
about the E. Jean Carroll case.
He might try and attack her.
Well, whether we would learn something new about Trump if he tried to attack Oprah Winfrey during a live interview, or whether it would instead just confirm everything that we do know about him already, I think is maybe a good way to end this conversation, and we will let the listeners determine for themselves if that would indeed be newsworthy and informative.